This video is part of the online course Europe and Young People, How Citizenship Works in the European Context.
What kind of young European citizens do we have at the moment? Well, the question of the kind of European citizen that we have at the moment really depends on how you define European citizen. Are you referring to European citizen the way it's defined by the European Union, in other words, young people who hold EU citizenship? Or do you refer to the idea of young people living in Europe who are active in the democratic life of their communities, cities, countries, and so on? I'm not particularly interested in the former because it tells us nothing about the quality of youth citizenship. Unfortunately, the evidence we have for the latter is really very sketchy because much of the research is theoretical or policy-oriented, very little is empirical. There is some research that focuses on participants of European programs, and that says something about those young people who are already involved in some way in international youth work activities. But in every country in Europe, that is a very small minority of young people. And it says nothing, that research also says nothing about the participation of the wider youth citizenry in the countries of Europe, which of course is wider than the EU. One source, which is useful, is the Flash Eurobarometer Youth Study. The last survey was conducted in 2017, and it covers youth attitudes and their social and civic participation in the EU, country by country. Again, this data is not comprehensive for Europe because it covers data for the EU 15 or for the EU 28. But it depends on the question. And this data is really not the whole picture, because it depends on who participates in the survey. Nevertheless, it is useful. It offers the possibility to compare results over time because it's a repetitive survey. Using data about participation in civil society or in charitable organizations, the 2017 study concludes that youth participation is actually on the rise, and that specific issues revealing a sense of responsibility for the common good are really important to young people. Climate change, human rights, and global development, for example. We do need more research and specific data to understand that sense of political and social responsibility of young people, even if anecdotal evidence from high-profile youth social movements like Fridays for Future or Black Lives Matter would indicate that young people in Europe are most active politically and socially when they feel that they have a stake in the issues. So citizenship has something to do with your relationship with the issue. In German, we say, Bildung braucht Bindung. So education requires engagement or a connection. And I think that's very important to the youth citizenship, the youth citizenship debate. What kind of young European citizens do we want to have in the future? Well, frankly speaking, I find that to be something of a demagogic question. It's not really for me to say what young people in Europe should believe or do, but I do think it is important to talk to young people about how they see being a citizen and what they think about Europe and the European integration project. That should more clearly determine the nature of the European citizenship that is being promoted by the EU and the Council of Europe, in my opinion, in addition to the values of the institutions. These are commonly referred to as European values, which really is not accurate. Europeans hardly have a monopoly on those values. And historically, the many things done in the name of European values have been counter to human rights. Interestingly, the Council of Europe talks not about European citizenship or even about European citizens, but rather it talks about democratic citizenship and the culture of democracy in Europe. From my perspective and as a political educator, that is much more relevant and something worth striving for than the idea of a European citizenship based on national citizenship of EU member states, which is both discriminatory to all the Europeans who have not had the luck to be born inside the EU. If anything, I would like to see young Europeans being more aware of the stakes involved when they do not use their formal rights as citizens, voting, standing for office. when they take no active interest in politics or in current political and social issues and situations. Active young people are an essential prerequisite for the health of democracies, for the defense of human rights and the rule of law. What kinds of citizens does Europe need, or what kind of Europe do citizens need? On the first part of this question, I don't propose to know what kind of citizens Europe needs, but the general sense is that active citizens are an important part of a healthy democracy. This said, not all European countries are democracies, and not all of Europe wants active citizens that hold governments to account, no matter the European rhetoric. This is increasingly clear from some of the laws and measures that have been put in place to curtail the space for civic participation and dissenting voices, also known as the shrinking space for civil society. A trend that is developing across the EU and the Council of Europe, and all the more noteworthy for the fact that it is taking root in quite a number of established democracies in Western Europe, as well as the famous cases in Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary. This is a growing fault line in European societies and in the institutions. The legitimacy of the European integration project rides on whether or not the EU can demand certain standards in human rights protection, rule of law, and democratic practice in exchange for the promise of improved prosperity and welfare. Right now, its credibility hangs in the balance, as its member states stamp all over the rule of law and still get access to funds for the post-COVID recovery, as the result of the recent EU multi-year financial framework shows. I'm pretty sure that those young people who are well informed about this kind of political process consider this a disgrace, but frankly, not that many young people around Europe are really aware of it. On the second part of this question, what do we mean by Europe? If we mean the EU and policies and standards of the institutions, the Eurobarometer survey is again instructive. There are 3 ideas for the future of Europe that young people most agree with, according to the survey, from the options given. And these are that Europe should be promoting critical thinking and the ability to search for information in order to combat fake news and extremism. It should be providing easy access to information for young people who want to move and work abroad in order to encourage youth employment. And it should be promoting behavioral change through environmentally friendly projects such as sustainable transport or recycling systems across Europe. I think it is also clear from recent events that a Europe of solidarity, access to health, inclusion and representation is important to young people. I conclude from this that the EU and its institutions need to be more human and less technocratic, less econometric. But that has been the case from the very beginning. We can also think about this in an aspirational sense, from the point of view of the values of the integration project, the ideal of Europe of peace, at peace among partners and neighbours, and with the planet. We've a long way to go for that Europe to be what young people see and feel. What kind of youth work would be adequate for today's European realities? What is the role of critical youth citizenship in today's Europe? We need a more politically literate youth work to support young people to engage with what is going on in the world around them, not just in their own personal lives or in the daily soap opera of Instagram and TikTok. That means a youth work that addresses, takes apart and seeks to understand political and social processes and the place and positioning of young people themselves in those processes, and one which helps young people to change that positioning if they feel this is important to them. How does critical youth citizenship differ from classical youth citizenship? What is the critical dimension? Well, I think there are a number. One is a healthy skepticism. Another is working and engaging with power and asymmetric power relations as an abstract concept, but also as a reality in European societies. Another is the courage to speak up and to support young people to speak up. A fourth would be the ambition for change in one's own and other people's circumstances, and active work in the context of youth work towards that. And finally, a fifth critical dimension is the uncompromising stance on human rights, rule of law, and deep democracy. How does youth work need to change in order to bring a vision of Europe from the future? Well, I think in the first place, it means to stop seeing itself as only leisure time activities or as prevention of different kinds of social ills or as a provider of services to the authorities. Those things are, of course, important, but they aren't enough. And the history and science behind youth work show this is not what it's for, only. In the second place, it means to get back to the basics of a critical pedagogy and learn how to be political again. If the idea is to work with young people's ideas about how Europe should be in the future, their vision, then youth work actually has to talk about Europe, work on that visioning, and take time to communicate, with those who can change something about how Europe actually is and is developing. What does political mean in the context of youth work? Well, it means, at least for me, it means talking truth to power. Political in the context of youth work refers to both the content and the approach of youth work. It means addressing political and social issues of the day that are important for young people, but also for the whole society, and proposing activities that are both dialectical and discursive. In other words, that make inquiry into the contradictions and dilemmas of our times, that propose solutions to those, but also that involve, dialogue, discussion, conversation, debate. Actually, it means to use critical pedagogy, a very well-established educational approach, and something that is not unknown to youth work over the years. Actually, youth work was a pioneer of critical pedagogy in the 70s and in the 80s. It's non-partisan. Political youth work is non-partisan. It means it doesn't favor one political party or another, right? It doesn't even favor one political position or another. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't take a stand. Quite the opposite. There are some very basic standards, values, like, for example, human dignity or the acceptance of others fully in their difference, that are absolutely essential. And it means actively to actively defend that standpoint. It can also mean to make or address policy, or it can mean to demand support for reform. But it doesn't necessarily have to mean sort of active engagement in the political process. What is the role of youth workers in politicizing youth work, and is that their role at all? Well, it's not the only role of youth workers, but as facilitators and educators, I do think that youth workers have a role to play in politicizing youth work. In fact, I believe it is part of the identity of an educator and must again become a clear part of the identity of youth workers. Educational science tells us that all education is political. There are two reasons for this. Education is the object of policy, and all policies are the result of negotiations and compromises in politics. So education is also a product of politics. Second, the role of education, especially in the national context, has historically been to produce good citizens of the state. That is a political construct and a normative one, and clearly an ideological proposition. In other words, education is never objective or neutral, even when it comes to scientific facts. Just look at the current situation with Corona. Fact or fiction? Conspiracy or science? So, one of the roles of youth workers who are educators is to create space for political literacy and engagement through youth work activities, and to facilitate the communication of those to the political system.
This video is part of the online course Europe and Young People, How Citizenship Works in the European Context. The course has been funded with support of the Erasmus Programme in the field of youth.